welcome back to Pi with a PE.
That's
Security and access controls for your Amazon S3 data lake. So in Kevin's keynote this morning, he mentioned S3 and data lakes. So I'm here now to put Becky on the spot to discuss the security and access control for those data lakes. But first, Becky, for anyone who joined the stream since first thing this morning, would you like to reintroduce yourself and tell us about your favorite Pi?
Okay, well, this is who I am. My name is Becky Weiss. I'm an engineer at AWS. I work on S3, and I've worked at AWS for about 8 years, and my focus for most of that time has been what we call, in our words, security in the cloud. What that means is these are the controls that our customers use to secure their data, their workloads, their networks, all of the things that they put in the cloud, making sure that they're accessible by the right entities and often from the right networks. So I've been sort of following that theme around AWS for a bunch of years, and of course that theme is very relevant to our topic at hand today, which is data lakes. We'll explain what a data lake is and what kinds of security you're trying to apply to a data lake. But you asked me about Pi.
I did. Favorite Pi?
And my favorite Pi is Cherry Pi. Again, it has special significance in my family. It means somebody gets a Cherry Pi if they're starting a new thing, new year of school, that kind of thing. So it's kind of a sweet thing for us. You've already registered my vote on this, Steve.
Although Cherry is falling behind in the vote, so I'm tempted to cheat and have an extra one.
People just aren't thinking about it. Yeah.
All right, so let's go back to the mention of data lakes that we had in the keynote today. So, it's quite possible not everyone is fully up to speed on data lake concepts, and I would freely admit that I'm one of them. Okay, so how would you define a data lake?
Okay, well, data lake, this is a buzzword. You probably heard this word thrown around a lot. And in fact, in the year 2022, modern use cases in S3, a lot of them are what our customers call, what the industry calls, a data lake. Now, a data lake kind of evokes this image of a gigantic, a lake, with lots of stuff, water, fish, stuff like that swimming around in it. It is kind of an apt analogy. So if you look up data lake on the internet, I think you get a definition like a centralized repository that allows you to store all of your structured and unstructured data at any scale. Well, let me break that down for you. Any scale, that's actually what we do great in S3, right? Yeah. Like at any scale, you notice, if you look at anything with S3, you notice that you never tell S3 how many gigabytes are going to be in your bucket. It scales with you, so you can just keep putting data in it with lots of different cost optimization options. But the structured and unstructured data, this is where it gets interesting, right? Because if you think about the kinds of data that modern businesses use, it's lots of different things, right? The structured data is these objects, this data in the cloud actually represents databases and tables. Often these are in well-known formats like JSON, CSV, Parquet. You might have heard of some of these. And a lot of analytics tools out in the world, some we have at AWS, such as Athena, Redshift Spectrum, Glue. These services in AWS, and there's a whole ecosystem of partner applications, and customers often build their own workloads, understand this structure, ingest it, might even, to take AWS Athena as an example, let you perform queries, SQL queries over your structured data that's just sitting there in S3. And then, of course, there's unstructured data. You're keeping photos, you're keeping videos, you're keeping text files, and these don't have that database and table structure. A data lake is kind of all of the above, with the significant thing about a data lake being what you can surround it with. So you have this lake, and you can surround it with analytics workloads, machine workloads. All of them help the owners of the data extract value from this massive amount of data that they have. So that's how you can think of a data lake. It really is a lake with lots of different ways to extract value out of it surrounding it.
So you touched on a couple of things there, size, scale, massive storage. But is there a point at which my S3 storage becomes a data lake?
Yes, it's at 100 gigabytes. No,
100 gigabytes.
There is, that's actually, so, we've got lots of different kinds of customers using S3 of really at every possible point along the size spectrum. And what makes you a data lake is not so much how much data that you're storing in the cloud, because that's going to be wildly different depending on what you're doing and what your business is and what your use cases are. Really, the dimension that sort of puts you into that data lake category, where the data lake solutions out there start to be more relevant to you, are really those that involve single storage of data, in our case in S3,
yeah.
Surrounded by lots of different possible applications, workloads, analytics, machine learning. Being able, there's a lot of value in this actually, because in the world before a data lake, you had these data silos. You had, different parts of a business. They might produce kind of these siloed sets of data, and it was all sort of within their own silo that they would have the data, they would do something with the data. If somebody else needed their data, they might actually make a copy into some other silo. And so a data lake actually simplifies a lot of that, allows for a lot more flexibility on what you're going to do with this data, because you don't have to keep copying it around these different silos in order to be able to get more out of a set of data that you have. For many of our customers that I talk to, the data that they hold is really the crown jewels of the organization. So the name of the game for them is really doing more with their data. You heard Kevin in our keynote today talk a bit about the importance of analytics and other kinds of workloads to a modern business.
Yeah. So going back to the first session, Shaki talked about managing S3 security at scale.
Yes.
Okay, and really that's the first thing that anyone needs to figure out, right? Before you put data into the cloud, right? Is it secure? Who can you access it? What can they do with it? Can we recap and dive a little bit deeper into what S3 offers that makes it straightforward to keep a data lake secure?
Yeah. Well, when you're talking about securing a data lake, imagine some of the data maybe that your business has in AWS. And if you really think about it, if you kind of break down what, obviously you want to secure that data. What exactly do you mean by that? Well, if you think about it like sort of one level more deeply, there are actually two levels on which you're probably interested in securing your data. One level is what I would call data as infrastructure. Considering your S3 buckets as just cloud infrastructure that you have, and there's lots of other cloud infrastructure that you have. You'll have like EC2 instances and Lambda functions and other kinds of compute. You'll have databases. Well, so your S3 bucket is one piece of, maybe among many, of cloud infrastructure you have. And you're going to want to secure this as cloud infrastructure. What do I mean by that? I kind of mean coarse-grained controls, right? Regard this S3 bucket as a thing, and make sure that on this thing, we've created a good perimeter, right? Outsiders who I'm not expecting to access the data have no way to access the data, which is true by default. And Shaki, talked about a lot of ways in which to do that. And then also, often there's a network component. I might have networks that are expected to access my bucket. And all of this regards data as infrastructure. Now, just to sort of quickly touch on that second point that we'll talk about, and I hope we'll get to talk about in a little more detail later. The first part is data as infrastructure. The second part, I'd call it data as data, and has access patterns that are sort of all its own. But let's talk about data as infrastructure, because when you watched Shaki's talk a little while ago about managing security at scale, it was mostly up in that layer. So again, you want to just protect this data kind of as a unit. And there's a lot of features in S3.
I was going to ask you, what are the actual goals and techniques at that level?
I would say there's really two main techniques, that if you've done these things, you are in a very, very good spot in terms of data as infrastructure security in this data lake. The first one is this feature, block public access. And you'll notice that if you go into our console in S3 and create a bucket, you will see that option has already been pre-selected for you. Of course, you can opt out of it, but it's rare that you wouldn't want it. Block public access is a way to block inadvertently public data in your S3 bucket. Your S3 bucket is private by default. In fact, it's only accessible within your same AWS account by default until there's some sort of explicit configuration made to share it. And block public access is a way to say, you know what? I'm not expecting any configurations that will make this data public. And that's what, and so blocks anybody who inadvertently creates such a configuration. And if you have a bucket that was inadvertently configured that way, it will in fact remove the effect of that so that your bucket is once again private. So that's one thing. And you can even turn this on across your whole account. I recommend that because in almost all modern cases in S3, data lakes, not data lakes, everything you want to, most everything you want to do, this is an appropriate setting for you. The other one, and this is a fairly new feature, again, modern use cases of S3 probably call for disabling this ACL feature. As we talked about before, this ACL feature has been there since the beginning of S3. It went with storage for the internet. A very useful feature, particularly in the early days, because S3 actually was invented quite a while before AWS Identity and Access Management was. And of course, IAM, Identity and Access Management, is how you control bucket as infrastructure type permissions today. And so by disabling ACLs, you just kind of remove this way of sharing your data because you don't need it. And you'll notice, again, if you go to our S3 console and you create a brand new bucket, you'll notice that we have pre-selected the option of disabling ACLs. Of course, you can use ACLs if you have some sort of, very specific use case that very specifically relies on them. They haven't gone away. But most use cases, it's simpler without them.
And of course, if I'm using ACLs, because I have pre-existing buckets, and I'm all set up and configured, and I decide to go the no ACL route, I can go backwards if I need to.
Absolutely. Operational safety is something that we obsess over. Speaking as an AWS engineer, when we take an operational action on our infrastructure, we want to be very sure that you can roll it back, right? Just in case somebody made a mistake. Absolutely true with ACLs. So like if you have an existing bucket and you've had it for, 15 years, and the ACLs are there and you're pretty sure it's okay, you've looked at the use cases, you know that you've written a bucket policy that accurately reflects how you're sharing this data. You can go disable these ACLs, and if you got that wrong, if you're seeing access blocked that you didn't know about before, weren't accounting for, you can roll it back. Nothing's gone. So that makes this a very operationally safe, from our perspective, thing to do.
As we like to say at AWS, it's not a one-way door.
Yeah, this is really not a one-way door.
Cool. So that's storage level access control.
Okay.
Let's get a little bit more finer grain now, because I'm sure there are people coming to S3 that are new to S3 and looking at it and thinking, okay, I'm used to file systems.
That's right.
Isn't S3 a file system?
Okay, S3 is not a file system, Steve. Yeah, now I wouldn't blame you for thinking that S3 is a file system, because actually, again, you go back to S3's roots, storage for the internet, and it was very deliberately made to resemble a file system so that it would be a familiar construct in the world, because that was the construct for data back then, file system, right? So basically we wanted to make something that resembled that in the cloud. So what we did is, back then of course I wasn't there, but what was done in S3 is the names of the objects, they can have slashes in them, right? Slashes are meant to make you think of directories.
Yep.
And actually, that fact is used by many of our customers as a mechanism for grouping data the same way you would with folders in a file system. But the truth is, those slash characters, they are just characters in a string. Those folders that you see don't actually have meaning in the technical implementation of S3. S3 is basically a giant, scalable, durable, secure, global key value store for data objects, right? And those names of objects are really just sort of their locator in S3.
It's a common question I get when I'm out talking. It's that people will say, "Is S3 a file system?" Because all of our tooling presents it like a hierarchical file system.
Because that's the familiar model. So and then if you think about permissions, right? When you talk about that second level of securing a data lake, of data is data, many users of S3 think about it in terms of those file systems. Even if you know S3 is not a file system, you're often thinking about permissions, those fine-grained permissions, right? Not everybody's going to have access to all of the data in all of the buckets. Think about a typical corporate use case. Think about how your employer manages data. It's probably not true that you have access to all of the data that your employer has, right? There's some fine-grained permission in there. Maybe you're a member of some group and therefore you get access to some data set, or you join some project, so that project has some data. Constructs like that actually are sort of more closely aligned to that kind of hierarchical system that we see with file systems. So S3's permission system, identity and access management, actually does support those kinds of relationships in actually a very sort of simple way. You can write S3 policies. When you write those IAM policies, you'll notice, different components. If you ever looked at an IAM policy, you'll notice that there's an effect. It says allow or deny. It's applied to a bucket. There's a principle. It says who it's talking about. There's an action. It says what they can do. And then there's a resource. And the resource refers to, could refer to all the objects in an S3 bucket if you're trying to grant access broadly. Or you can actually do wildcard matching, which does lend itself to this folder type thing, because you can do, my bucket /path/ folder 1/* gives you access just to the data under that, because those are the ones whose strings will match that string. So it's very straightforward like that to kind of mentally map that file system's permission into a permission that's understood by our object store.
So if I'm coming to S3 from a file system perspective, I'm moving to the cloud for the first time, I understand file system principles, users, groups, etc.
Right.
Do they carry over into identity and access management?
Yeah, they do. Now, exactly how they do that kind of depends a bit on the scale and I would say shape of these access patterns. I'll give you the simplest example. So in AWS's identity and access management system, the identities are, each account in AWS has a local pool of IAM identities. These are called IAM principals. If you have an identity, if you are using AWS, calling AWS's APIs, you have some kind of identity in that account. There's IAM users and IAM roles. Roles are actually, for both machine and human access, are kind of the dominant ones in a modern workload. And that means that your various users are represented in some way with IAM roles. So now, of course, any data lake worth its salt is being accessed both by machines, by applications, as well as by people, right? Who are looking at the data, who are performing analytics on the data. For machines, an IAM role are compute offerings in AWS, so EC2, Lambda, ECS, all of the many places where you might build an application and run it on AWS. These all have great integrations with IAM roles. You can just associate an identity and IAM with them, and they'll deliver the necessary credentials to your application. Often you don't even know this is happening because you're using our SDK that takes care of all the details. So your compute, you can give your different applications identities, and you can give those identities permissions in S3, including this hierarchical pattern that I talked about. For people in a modern AWS environment also get mapped into IAM roles. That's through a process. The $5 word for that is federation. We have AWS single sign-on if you want to set up federation. But federation really means these people have identities, often in a directory that you have for your business, and they log in using that, or they don't keep separate credentials in AWS. They log in using whatever identity provider they have, and this federation provider into AWS, either AWS SSO or maybe your Active Directory Federation services. There's a number of ways that our enterprise customers set this up. They map these different users into IAM roles in the AWS account, and a role in this case actually does mean what the word role, lowercase r role in English means. Typically your user will select a project-based role on their way into AWS, and so that allows the users to choose what project they're going to act as, what role they're going to take in AWS, and then you can do these permissions based on that. Scaling up a bit from that, right? Because like I said, this depends on size. Well, what if your organization is big enough that you have, that you have maybe thousands of these identities and entities needing to access the S3 bucket. Well, in AWS, you can model that as well to go up a level in scale in order to group these identities to talk about who's part of this project and who's part of that project when these things are not, just modelable straight as a one-to-one, Steve over here is Steve over there, is something called tagging. In AWS, you can tag these IAM identities. Tag is basically assign a key value pair, but the real power with the tagging is that you can refer to it in your policy. So again, you can take one of these hierarchical locations in S3, something that looks like a folder, and allow a group of principals who are all tagged a certain way, maybe tagged according to this project, because this data location corresponds to the project.
And these tags, they're just the same kind of tags that I would use with other resources, like
That's right.
EC2 instances,
That's right.
etc.
Yeah, no,
that's
it's a
cool.
very powerful and ubiquitous construct in AWS. It's basically a way to attach metadata to your resources, to your identities that have significance in authorization. So this is a really powerful tool for doing data-shaped data as data sort of permissions in AWS.
I was going to ask you, how do S3 access points play into this?
Okay, so S3 access, we heard a little bit about access points before.
Yeah.
So access points are, what an access point is in short, it's an alternative endpoint into S3. I can give you a visual here. Imagine the S3 bucket is like a giant, well, I'll use a cultural reference here, a big gulp. If you're an international viewer, you don't know what I'm talking about, and if you're an American viewer, you definitely do. You have this bucket of data, and it's a way to create other straws through which to be able to retrieve the data. I was going to say suck it out, but that seems untoward for this Pi Day broadcast. So it's a way to get alternative endpoints into this bucket. And you saw with our multi-region presentation, you saw that they kind of made use of this alternative endpoint as sort of an abstraction point to say, like, well, it could be this bucket in this region or that bucket in that region. Amazon Global Accelerator is going to figure it out on the fly. But that construct actually has a use in the realm of data lake permissions as well. And it was, in fact, the reason why the access point feature was initially conceived in 2019. So here's the thing. When you need to share, like I mentioned, I don't think I can say this enough. Your S3 bucket is private to your account. It's local to your account. It's only accessible within your account unless you configure something to be able to share it. But if you do want to configure your bucket for sharing, you use that S3 bucket policy. In Shaki's presentation, she showed you some examples of a bucket policy. Now, as you start to have data-shaped permissions in your S3 bucket, well, you've got this folder, really this prefix, that folder, the other folder, the people with these tags, the people with those tags, this IAM role, that IAM role. You start to actually, at scale, you start to get a fairly complex document. This document grows in size, which of course creates some challenges from a manageability perspective, right? You're managing a bunch of diverse use cases all in this one document, and access points allow you to modularize that. So you can create access points on a bucket, and one thing that we've seen our customers be particularly successful with access points is when they need to sort of break out or modularize their access patterns, it lets them break out their access patterns into these different discrete sets of use cases. I'll give you a concrete example. Suppose that you are in the business of providing data sets to subscribers, right? And people subscribe to your data sets, people unsubscribe, you want to share. One thing that can be very useful with access points is to actually have an access point correspond to a particular data set, meaning a prefix in an S3 bucket. And then you can control its permissions to subscribers separately from maybe permissions on another data set that serves a different set of use cases. So it allows you to break these things out, manage them separately from each other, and when you're talking about different data sets in a data lake, that can be quite useful.
So it really helps improve manageability.
It helps improve
Speaking to
manageability. It
scale
also
out.
helps improve scale because just, very simply, each of these access points has its own policy document, so it lets you really scale this out.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Becky. I understand a lot more about data lakes now than I ever did. And I'm fascinated by this term, data-shaped permissions. Was it used?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm going to have to go and dig into that more.
Oh, I made that up. There's nothing to dig into.
Oh, I have to go and look into that.
Okay.
That is awesome.
You can go look into it. It's not there.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you so
Okay,
much, Steve.
So we're going to move on now to a new section called Badge That, AWS Object and Block Learning Badges. Now, I'm also a news blogger outside of my role as a .NET and PowerShell DA, and one of my most favorite posts I wrote last year was about the announcement at reInvent of these new digital learning badges. They were absolutely great. If you've not heard about these, basically it's a set of courses. They're free to take with the assessment, and you can get a digital badge for taking, which verifies your achievement. You can take that. You can share it on your social media platforms. And through Credly, and it shows that, hey, I know all about block storage, I know about object storage, and so on. So we're going to be joined now by Christy and Fatima to talk about Badge That.
Excellent.